Sorry, I'm out of intro ideas. But hey, now that I have your attention, hi, I would like to talk about Amphoreus, partly because that's where the Astral Express is headed next, and partly because I was a little perplexed at the prospect of there being a planet Akavili hasn't visited. Seems to me that there aren't that many of those, so there must be some sort of extraordinary circumstances that prevented the path of the Trailblaze from reaching Amphoreus. And I find that quite interesting. The way I see it, either Amphoreus doesn't actually exist in the real world, which is very possible since it's only revealed through the Garden of Recollection, or the second possibility is that Amphoreus was deliberately hidden from Akavili, which is actually something that's happened before. Apparently, Welt's planet, Earth, was another planet Akavili never reached, and it was also a planet that had been hidden away, and yet a memo keeper still knows of it and can travel freely there. Coincidence? Maybe. If it happens a third time, I'm gonna get real suspicious, but until then, I'm a little bit more interested in taking a look at what we know about Amphoreus right now to see if we can't figure out where this strange planet fits within the fabric of Star Rail's greater universe. Cause even though Amphoreus is hidden away and isolated, it is still under the influence of the Eons, and it's also gotta still be a part of Star Rail's history, somehow. So that is the topic of today's video. We're gonna start things off with a brief overview of what we know about Amphoreus, then move on to some historical events that may be relevant, and finish the video off with some theorizing. This should be really fun, so I hope you're ready. There are timestamps, citations, attributions, and links to related content in the description box, and if I have any corrections or notes I want to add, you can find those in the pinned comment. There's no spoiler warnings this time though, because I'm just assuming that if you're watching this, you are up to date on all the biggish quests, and have also watched the special program. I feel like that's fair. And now, we are off to Amphoreus. Legend says that in its antiquity, Amphoreus was a prosperous planet full of people who worshipped 12 godlike entities called Titans. These Titans were born from 12 core flames, which represented their divinity and granted them their purpose within the world. The Foundation Titans, Georios, Fagusa, and Aquila, made the earth, sea, and sky, while the Fate Titans, Orynyx, Janus, and Tilantin, oversaw time, space, and laws. The Creation Titans, Kefali, Circes, and Menistia, created humankind and probably some other things we don't know about yet, and the Calamity Titans, Nicodor, Thanatos, and Zagreus brought conflict to Amphoreus in the form of war, death, and trickery. Several enlightened civilizations blossomed under the guidance of these godlike Titans. But this golden era only lasted until a heretical black tide came from beyond the sky, driving the Titans and the people of Amphoreus into madness. Now, Amphoreus' day-night cycle was always determined by the Sky Titan opening and closing their eyes, but after the arrival of the black tide, they closed their eyes and shrouded the entire world in darkness. The world-bearing Titan, Kefali, tried to protect the people by hoisting this massive dawn device on their back, bringing light to the city of Okema, where most of the population currently lives. And then the Titan went into a deep sleep, which is probably why they haven't succumbed to the Black Tide madness, unlike the rest of Amphoreus. But in this slowly dying world, there is a prophecy. Chosen heroes must overthrow each Titan and seize their core flames in a pilgrimage known as the Flame Chase. The core flames should be offered to the Vortex of Genesis, and when all 12 core flames are collected, a miracle of Genesis shall occur. 6 of the 12 flames have already been recovered, so there are 6 remaining. And somewhere within this prophecy, there's also mention of the Astral Express appearing too, so I get the feeling that the Trailblazer is not just an observer here, but an active participant. The devs did also mention that the Trailblazer will apparently become a monarch at some point, and I don't really think they're talking about the butterfly here. Now here's the thing. I think Amphoreus wasn't always isolated and hidden. I think there was a time in history when Amphoreus was accessible to the outside and maybe even participated in intergalactic trade. Think about it for a second. It's referred to as a dead or dying planet, and it was likely destroyed or killed off by the Black Tide. And based on Herta's words, we can assume that this destruction forced Amphoreus to be stuck in some sort of stasis or a cycle or a loop that they can't break free of. So perhaps they're considered dying because they're not actually dead, but they're not really alive either. But if they can break free of this loop, then they will incite the miracle of Genesis, which will allow them to be recreated or reborn. To put it another way, it kind of sounds like Amphoreus died and is now stuck in limbo, fighting for a chance to be resurrected and therefore return to the land of the living. And this sort of of limbo status could be why no one knows of it. Its memory could either have been lost to time, or Amphoreus' very identity has been warped while it was stuck in limbo. Now, I think this is a pretty fair assumption to make based on the information we have, and some may be content to leave everything there. But the special program said that the Astral Express crew will be split into 2 teams. One team will investigate Amphoreus on the inside, and another will investigate Amphoreus from the outside. Now, the fact that they're actually doing this, having one group be inside the planet and one be on the outside, makes it feel like the outside events are actually just as important as the inside events. And I think it's a little difficult to look at the inside events and figure out, like, what's going on in Amphoreus for realsies, because everything inside Amphoreus seems to be cloaked in an aura of mystique and myth and legend. As for the outside influences, we only really know of the 3 paths of the eons that intersect at Amphoreus, and I'm certain the presence of the eons matters, and we're definitely going to talk about it later in this video, but they're not the reason why the planet died in the first place. The Black Tide is. And it just so happens that the Black Tide is the only other known external influence on the world of Amphoreus. So if we want to figure out what happened to Amphoreus, we should probably dive a little deeper into the origins of the Black Tide. So let's do that. So, where do we begin investigating something as nondescript as a black tide of madness? Kinda feels like that riddle will take a genius to figure out. Well, maybe Herta knows. After all, her simulated universe expansions usually provide some historical context that become relevant within the main story pretty quickly. I mean, the first expansion we got was all about the swarm disaster, and that turned out to be very relevant on both the Luafu and Penacony, since it gave us some context for the death of Tayzeranth and the assimilation of Enna. Now, I really don't think we're gonna deal with the swarm disaster on Amphoreus as well, because, you know, we still have a few open-ended plot lines out there that are still dealing with all of that, and it just feels like it's time to move on to something else. So if the first simulated universe expansion became relevant, what about the second one? I am, of course, referring to Gold and Gears, because it just so happens that after combing through everything in it, I think there's actually something in Gold and Gears that matches our criteria for the Black Tide of Madness perfectly. Now, I would just dive into the explanation of what I think this Black Tide of Madness candidate is all about, but something tells me that none of you actually read Golden Gears, and honestly, I don't blame you. That's a lot of boring text to sift through. So before I get to that explanation, I think we should probably summarize the historical events within that expansion first, and then I can pitch you my case for the whole Black Tide thing. Okay? Okay, here's the summary of events. The Golden Gears expansion is basically the story of the events that happened after Tayzeranth was sealed in amber by Klapoth and Enna was assimilated by Xipe. The aftermath of the swarm disaster triggered a massive expansion effort on behalf of the IPC, and this resulted in the Border Star trade war, which was kind of like an intergalactic economic disaster that only came to an end when one of the IPC's founders, Louis Fleming, finally retired. But what should have been a normal retirement speech turned into a huge historical event when Fuli made an appearance, and a flood of memories that could be interpreted as a kind of prophecy split into 3 revelations. The first revelation was a prediction from Finality, the second a riddle from the Enigmata, and the third a calculation from Noose. We only care about Noose's calculation for right now because Noose's calculation stated that the universe would experience 3 unchangeable moments. The first would be the start of the Border Star trade war, which at this point had already happened. The second was the rise of Rupert, and the third was Rupert's death. Now, you guys have probably never heard of Rupert, and that's totally fine, completely understandable. As far as I know, he's only ever been mentioned in side events like Golden Gears or readables and flavor text. But he is just about as important to the history of Star Rail as Tayzeranth is, so we best get familiar with him now, huh? So Rupert is actually a robot, but not just any robot. He was a trashed robot found in a junk heap that miraculously gained sentience. And he eventually expanded his cognitive capabilities so greatly that he caught the attention of Noose and became Genius Society member number 27. But Rupert isn't a cool Genius Society member like Herta. Rupert was speciest. Rupert hated organic life forms. He believed that all organic life was imperfect and only inorganic life could be perfect, so he decided it would be a great idea to completely wipe out all organic life. To accomplish this, Rupert established an empire of Intellitrons and other machines, which would later become Screwlum's empire, but that's another story for another day. But in addition to this soon-to-be army of an empire, Rupert also developed a sort of virus known as the anti-organic equation, and true to its name, it helped inorganic life find ways of destroying organic life. And this was the beginning of what came to be known as the Machine Emperor's War, and the damage from this war was so severe that it rivaled that of the Swarm disaster, and it continued until Rupert was murdered, fulfilling Noose's third calculated unchangeable moment. Incidentally, Nanook's home planet witnessed both the horrors of the Swarm disaster and the Machine Emperor's War in quick succession, and it was that level of devastation from both events that led to their ascension into Eonhood. I only mention this because I think it's very interesting that Amphoreus shares this golden blood imagery with Nanook, given how likely it is that Amphoreus was destroyed by the same event Nanook's home planet was, the Machine Emperor's War. Let me show you what I mean. During the Machine Emperor's War, one galaxy in particular was absolutely decimated. This galaxy was the Laurel Wreath Galaxy, which was governed by the Philosophers' Union, and the leader of that union was named Aurelius, likely a reference to Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, who was also known as the Philosopher King. Rupert's army destroyed many planets in the Laurel Wreath Galaxy, and then they forced the Philosopher King to die by ingesting poison in front of a live audience. Now, you probably picked up on this, but much of the Laurel Wreath Galaxy is based on the ancient Greeks and Romans, which is where the galaxy gets its name. Laurel wreaths were worn as crowns of victory or to denote one's status or their academic achievements. So they're pretty iconic. Now, there are two characters in Star Rail who wear laurel wreaths. There's Dr. Ratio and Aglaia, both of whom boast other Greek and Roman influences. Now, these shared influences do make me wonder if both characters may have a deeper connection to the Laurel Wreath Galaxy. It feels like a pretty logical conclusion in the case of Aglaia and Amphoreus if we think of Amphoreus as one of the planets destroyed in the Machine Emperor's War within the Laurel Wreath Galaxy, but as for Ratio, we don't really know where he's from, but there is evidence to suggest that he could be from a surviving planet in the Laurel Wreath Galaxy. See, he was recommended to a university by a man named Rond who dated his letter via the Philosopher Calendar, so I suspect he may have been from the Philosophers' Union, which, given the prominence of Greek and Roman philosophers, might be a faction from the Laurel Wreath Galaxy, hence my suggestion that this could be where Ratio's homeworld is located. The philosophy connection matters a little bit more than you'd think here. See, Sparkle is known for breaking the fourth wall and pulling strings behind the scenes, so while she might be a little bit cryptic at times, she's usually an excellent vector for foreshadowing. And as luck would have it, she shows up in the Cosmodyssey event, which is named after the Odyssey, which is also Greek. How very fitting. So in her appearance in the event, Sparkle gives you an invitation addressed to Smarty Club number 888 Miss Philosophy Professor, which is likely a reference to the Philosophers' Union as well as the Genius Society. You can make a case for the Smarty Club being the Intelligentsia Guild, but the Genius Society members are always numbered, so I think that's more likely. Plus, I know this is going to sound like a dubious connection at best, but a sideways 8 from the 888 is the shape that Amphoreus takes, and it's also the number of doctorate degrees that Ratio has, which I know sounds like a ridiculous thing to mention, but there's like this whole thing with Ratio's backstory about not understanding why Noose hasn't accepted him into the Genius Society despite being one of the greatest geniuses of the era. And that feels really relevant to me, not just because Noose is really relevant in this whole thing, but also because Herta is actually a member of the Genius Society and she's involved. Plus, the Philosophers' Union is likely related to the Laurel Wreath Galaxy, where I think Amphoreus is, and Sparkle says she's performing in a play called The Eternal Land, Amphoreus's Ionic Age. And the character that she's playing is the divine mecha that's in charge of screenwriting, which makes her a god machine. Now, I don't know about you, but the god machine to me sounds a lot like Amphoreus's Titans. Like, just looking at them, don't they all look kind of like machines? Especially Aquila? And the Titankin, like the little Titan minion things, they also seem like artificially animated golems. And I think those also qualify as machines. And since the Titans all have fragments of divinity within them, which are the core flames, then that should make them divine machines, right? Divine mechas. And if that's true, then we have increased the probability that Amphoreus both belongs to the Laurel Wreath Galaxy and that it was destroyed in the Machine Emperor's War. And if the Titans are actually machines and Amphoreus was part of the Laurel Wreath Galaxy, then that means that the black tide of madness that came from beyond the sky was most likely the anti-organic equation that Rupert created. I touched on this briefly in the Golden Gear summary, but basically the anti-organic equation was supposed to be installed onto machines where it would then alter their thought patterns and make them better at destroying organic life forms, like humans. The problem with this equation is that it was far from perfect. Not only did it sometimes glitch out and cause the machines to attack other machines, but it was also contagious and spread via magnetic waves, kind of like a virus. And as viruses can sometimes do, the anti-organic equation jumped species and began infecting organic life forms, altering their thought patterns as well. Anyone or anything that was infected by this mind virus exhibited behavior that can only be described as madness and excruciating pain. Now, doesn't that sound a heck of a lot like what happened to Amphoreus? A black tide descended and both man and machine were driven to madness? Of course, you might be wondering why a mind virus transmitted by magnetic waves, which are not visible to the naked eye last I checked, would then be described as some kind of all-encompassing darkness, to which I have two potential answers. The first is the easiest one and therefore the most likely. As the Sky Titan, Aquila would have been infected by the virus first, and in response, maybe they closed their eyes, which then shrouded Amphoreus in darkness as the madness began to spread. The two events would then be conflated with each other and boom, black tide of madness. Alternatively, the black tide could have been Memoria infected with the mind virus. After all, it's a liquid-like substance that carries thoughts. Plus, the anti-organic equation has a few similarities to the mimetic viruses that we saw in Rappa's quest on Penacony, and there's lots of memory and Memoria shenanigans going on there. Whichever way you slice it though, I think this virus is the perfect candidate given everything we know about Amphoreus. But even if all of this is true, there is still one very important question that we need answers to. How and why is Amphoreus in this bizarre state of slow degradation and isolation? And who's responsible for it? Let's be real, it was probably the eons. I mean, we've been told several times that three paths overlap in Amphoreus, and really, who else could force a dying world into an infinite loop besides an eon? Or three, because there are three meddling cosmic entities here. The first one is Remembrance, the second, Erudition, and the third hides behind them both. Remembrance makes total sense because this is likely the memories of a dying world that Fuli collected or wishes to collect. Erudition, on the other hand, probably makes less sense at first, but remember, it was Nous who calculated the events that led Rupert to start the Machine Emperor's War that allegedly got Amphoreus in this position in the first place. So technically, it makes a lot of sense, especially if you consider the fact that Nous desires certainty. If they calculated the fall of Amphoreus, then the fall of Amphoreus is inevitable. No one has been able to overcome Nous's predictions, not even other eons. So my hypothesis is that Amphoreus likely fell during the Machine Emperor's War, and then Fuli was going to collect the memory of that world to preserve it within the garden when a third path got involved. And that path is almost certain to be that of the Enigmata, so Mythos. Now, Mythos is kind of funny, because they were born from Fuli's garden out of spite for Nous's so-called certainty, which is why they're described as hiding behind both Remembrance and Erudition. But Mythos hates the certainty desired by Nous, so they challenge that certainty and understanding at every possible opportunity, cloaking truth in riddles and hiding history within fictional accounts full of red herrings, allegories, and misdirections. But unlike Aha, Mythos isn't doing all of this just to troll Nous. See, Mythos believes that the past dictates the future, so the more concrete the past, the more concrete the future. So, if an entity like Nous completely understands the history of a world and is certain about it, then the future of that world becomes fixed, unchangeable. And Mythos hates that, so they actively try to thwart that certainty by straight up changing facts into fiction. This sows uncertainty in the past, which leads to a future full of new possibilities instead of a single inevitability. And if you're trying to save a world from inevitable destruction, this is a pretty big deal. Now we know from Herta that Amphoreus needs to make some sort of choice in order to break their loop and create the world. And we also know of the prophecy that requires all 12 core flames to be offered to the vortex of Genesis in order to incite the miracle of Genesis. And I think it's Mythos' tampering that's given Amphoreus this possibility, this chance of restoring their world, thus defying Nous's certainty and proving that the future isn't set in stone. What's funny is I kind of feel like Penacony was foreshadowing all of this, which makes it extra fitting that Sunday is going to be in Amphoreus with us. Because see, Penacony was built on top of a Memoria fissure that was made by Mythos, who really enjoys dissolving realities and blending the physical world with the mental Memoria world. And while Memoria is supposed to contain memories, like solid records of history that should be remembered as absolute truth, when the Memoria comes into contact with Mythos, those memories are distorted in fantastical ways and they become dreams. And dreams are malleable to an absurd degree, and you can make that reality whatever you want it to be. So with Mythos' tendencies in mind, let me paint you a new picture of what the history of Amphoreus could have looked like. The Amphoreus of antiquity could have been a civilization that created giant robots to carry out planetary-scale operations, which they called Titans. This makes them out to be kind of similar to the people of Eurylos 6 and their engine of creation, because both the engine of creation and the Titans would have been meant for management of planets. Construction, terraforming, that kind of thing. Under the protection of the Titans, civilization would have flourished right up until Nous calculated those 3 unchangeable moments which led to the Machine Emperor's War. This would have been followed by the spread of the anti-organic equation virus, which would be particularly devastating to a planet that was managed and maintained by giant robot titans. So Amphoreus would have succumbed to the virus and then fell into chaos, slowly destroying itself and thus fulfilling Nous's prophecy. So assuming that somehow most of Amphoreus' physical form was destroyed, the only thing left would be the world's memory. So like a Memoria-based world, which would then fall under the domain of Fuli. But I think that the moment Amphoreus fell, Mythos began tampering with it. They muddled the memories of the Machine Emperor's War and the anti-organic equation virus until it was only remembered as the Black Tide of Madness. Now, I didn't mention this during my explanation of the anti-organic equation, but this is really important to understand. The madness caused by this virus's infection wasn't permanent. If you were able to isolate the afflicted person's memory of the mechanical war and either erase those memories completely or seal them away, you could cure them of the madness caused by the virus. Now, I'm assuming if you tampered with those memories, you'd also get some kind of similar effect. So if Mythos was to make those memories hazy or unclear, it wouldn't remove the virus entirely from history, but it could certainly diminish its overall effects. And that's what I think Mythos has done. And by lessening the effects of the virus, even by a little bit, Mythos has introduced doubt into Nous's certainty, and thus created a sort of paradox where a world that was destined to be destroyed cannot be destroyed because the thing that destroyed it didn't actually happen. In other words, the future of Amphoreus is no longer set in stone. Amphoreus now has a chance to defy its own destiny and perform the miracle of Genesis, effectively recreating their world. And I think the Trailblazer plays a really big part in this. I think they are, to a certain extent, an outside observer, someone meant to record the history of Amphoreus, kind of like a memo keeper. And that's why the Trailblazer catches Fuli's gaze right from the start. This is why they've received a pen and the book called As I've Written. Words in Amphoreus establish certainty, and certainty of the past determines the direction of the future. With a few quick strokes, fiction can become fact, and history can be rewritten. And should the Trailblazer succeed in becoming the author of Amphoreus and rewriting its history, then Mythos will also have succeeded in proving the fact that Nous's certainty is not infallible. And that is where my head is at going into Amphoreus. Now, I could very well be wrong about a lot of the connections I made today, but I thought all these little overlaps and coincidences were just too fun not to share. And I have a lot more connections than what I presented today. These were just all of the ones that kind of went together. If 3.0 has some stuff that supports a lot of the cut content I have, I might put that out as its own theory at some point. But in the meantime, I do have a couple of small observations that I can share with you while our lovely channel enablers scroll on by. So I'm like 90% sure that our little summon companion Mem is actually Cyrene here, who is also a variant of a very beloved character from Honkai Impact called Elysia. Now, Elysia sacrificed herself so the future could have hope, so her presence here is quite interesting, especially in light of Mythos' whole creating uncertainty in the future in order to save it. And it's especially interesting when you consider the similarities between her and March 7th. See, Cyrene's Chinese name means past ripples, and the fact that March 7th has close ties with Remembrance, which deals in the liquid Memoria mind juice and also crystallizes them so they look like ice, and the fact that March 7th seems to think that the process of dream weaving is very similar to the way that she makes her special 6-phase ice. And dreams are made whenever Mythos interferes with Fuli's Memoria. Well, it kind of feels like Cyrene and March 7th are like mirrors of each other somehow. Different possibilities. Also interesting that Mem looks a bit like Pom Pom, but with a tail, and the little ice sculptures of Pom Pom are part of March's kit. I thought that was kind of fun. Now, on a completely unrelated note, I also think that Anaxis might be related to a group who think that the flame chase process is total bunk, because in the first trailer it says that he has knowledge capable of refuting faith, like faith in the gods, and it kind of paints him as a kind of heretic. I also wonder if he knows that the gods are actually machines, because it looks like he's got a blueprint sitting next to him. And I'm just really suspicious of this whole Council of Elders thing that they kept putting into the special program, and I think it might be related to him, so just keep it in mind, I guess. But I think I'm gonna leave it all at that, so thank you all so much for watching, and the next time I see you, it'll be in Amphoreus. Unless you play Genshin or Zenless, in which case I'll see you before then. So, bye!